Hello, everyone. I'm Tim Kruger, and I work for the National Association of Cannabis Businesses, and I'm pleased to announce our next moderator, Mark Gorman. The National Association of Cannabis Businesses appointed Mark Gorman as Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer in March of 2020. He also serves as the association's primary government affairs advocate, capitalizing on this extensive experience in both state and federal government relations. Gorman joined the NACB from the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States, DISCUS, where he served for 20 years as the Senior Vice President for Government Relations, overseeing the distilled spirits industry's extraordinarily successful legislative, public policy, and advocacy programs. Prior to joining DISCUS, Mark directed political affairs at the National Restaurant Association. He is also a Capitol Hill veteran, having worked 6 years as the tax legislative assistant for United States Senator John H. Chafee. Under Gorman's guidance, NACB has worked to broaden support among the other cannabis groups, consumer protection agencies, and government policymakers for its responsibility standards and social equity programs. A graduate of Williams College in Williamstown, Massachusetts, Gorman lives in Alexandria with his wife, Colette, and they have 4 children. All right, Mark, sending it over to you now.
Okay, great. I when I was thinking about how to start off this program, I just thought I'd talk a little bit about a conversation the panelists had um, late last week, and it was a wide-ranging discussion, and we of course covered the issues of what of the promise of social equity programs, the to provide new business opportunities, to provide new employment, especially in uh, disadvantaged areas of the state, and and we talked about what are some of the good program features and what are some of the things that need to be fixed, which I think we'd like to hear everybody address. But we soon moved on to a question about whether social equity was a good title for the for this policy area. I think Dashita was very articulate about that. Portia was, but we decided that we should, well, we could probably talk on and on and more expansively about the socioeconomic issues, the bigger, broader issues of uh, of basically socioeconomic growth that probably we should stick to uh, at first, at least, to the areas um, of equity programs that grow out of cannabis legalization, that are sometimes funded by cannabis taxes, and explore that. What are some of the good things, successful things that you've seen, and talk about some of the improvements that need to be made, and um, and I want to thank, in particular, Sean Collins for finding the time to join us. He's the executive director of the Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission. They are deep into um, issues of social equity, how to improve their program. I know that Sean and his chairman and some other local groups in Massachusetts have actually appealed to the legislature to pass some remedial legislation. And I don't think it got done this past year, but I guess it gives you a starting point. Sean, um, let me just stop there and just say Sean Collins, once again, executive uh, director of the commission, a guy with his hands on the steering wheel, I'm sure, in lots of ways. Have I would say your state was one of the earliest adopters of social equity programs, and you didn't have a lot of other examples to follow. And So we are wondering if you can give a example or two of what you've done, that what you've created that you might have thought just hit the spot exactly right, and what things need remedial action.
Sure. Thanks, Mark, and thanks for inviting me. This is a certainly an important conversation. I know what's going on in most jurisdictions across the country, both certainly amongst businesses, local governments, state governments, and a lot of the jurisdictions that are coming now after Massachusetts, I think, are really finding ways to incorporate it into the legalization conversation as a whole. Back in 2016, when Massachusetts legalized, the ballot question had a line and a clause in it that was the commission not to put in place mechanisms to make up for those previous harms of the war on drugs, and the legislature in their course of remodeling and amending the legislation really put some context to that and charged our agency with developing uh, more and certainly more programming around it. And we really try to take that effort and take that ball and move it forward. But I think you actually started with a really great point, which is what is the promise of a social equity program? And I think that's actually a challenging question in a lot of ways because the answer really depends on who it is that you're asking. A lot of people, I think, have a lot of expectations as to what social equity programming means to them personally. And if you are either living in, residing in one of those areas that has been disproportionately impacted, or it's impacted you in your life, it's a really personal question. And I think as you look and see jurisdictions legalizing now something that previously was a crime, and you may yourself have that record and maybe have some difficulty getting it expunged, or your jurisdiction doesn't couple some of their efforts with expungement. It's hard to square that, and I think that's that promise of what is a social equity program. I think is a really challenging place to start, but it's worth having that conversation. In Massachusetts, we've really tried to put some effort in. We have a lot of work to do. So I'll give a brief overview of what we've been up to. We describe ourselves as being the first statewide program in the country. And as I was embarking on a bit of a journey across the country to our earlier states, and Joey certainly in Colorado and Portia in Oregon, I believe it's in Oregon, right?
In
There's,
Illinois.
excuse me, and there's a lot of work that I think went into and a lot of realization as far as setting up the mechanism, and that's a huge undertaking. Is it can't be that afterthought. And I think a lot of folks are really trying to again move that conversation to a marbling it into everything that you do. It became one of the challenges of if we could do it all over again, we would. And we, as a result, built into a lot of our early licensing. We have the economic empowerment applicant program, which certainly waives fees, which is it's nominal, but it's important. It allows folks to get priority review of their application. That application period to get that access was open for about 2 weeks. And if you didn't know about it, you couldn't access it, and you don't have that benefit now moving forward. We then built out our statewide social equity program. We're proud of it, but we're constantly evaluating it. And part of that evaluation is asking folks that were in that program, and we've now had two, we're in our second cohort. Did it offer what you expected? And was it satisfactory? Did you find what you needed in this program? And that program exists, it's 4 tracks. First is the entrepreneur track, which is I like to pursue licensure. I'd like to own a business. I want to go before the commission and get a license. The core track is I'm maybe not ready for licensure, but I do want to work in this industry. I think I could be a manager of a retail store. I think I could be the head of cultivation in a facility. The entry level and reentry track is I'm curious about this industry. I don't have a lot of experience with it, but I'd like to maybe be a bud tender, or I'm returning to society after some level of incarceration. And obviously, if you have that connection to cannabis in your background, this might be an opportunity for me. And I think it's a chance to build some technical assistance. And the last track is ancillary businesses, knowing that it's not just touching the plant. There are a lot of businesses that support this industry, that this industry can do good and do well by. For instance, IT, HVAC, electrical. I may have that history with cannabis. I don't want to touch the plant. I don't want to be in this industry necessarily. I found some trade skills or something on those lines, but my business can do well. I think we owe it to those businesses to train them up and offer some technical assistance. So this social equity program that we've built out is exactly that. It's a technical assistance program. It's meant to be an opportunity for folks to learn about the industry, learn about business planning. We've brought in a number of vendors. Our commission staff has been accessible and available to these folks. But like I mentioned, we're constantly evaluating it because we don't expect out of the gates we're going to get it right, not for lack of trying, but we know it's a moving target in a lot of ways. And I think the other point you raised about should we even call it social equity is because it is tough to define that way. And for us, it's I would give us a grade at least of being incomplete, and that's not meant to be a cop out. It's because our work is not done. It will not be done for some time. We are, as an agency, a licensing regulatory authority. That is our job. Our job is to license businesses and register agents, and now oversee a medical use of marijuana program that we took over from our, for instance, our local Department of Public Health. We're regulators, but we're also a mission-driven agency that has this programming arm to us. And those two, they're firewalled where appropriate, but we're trying to, as I mentioned earlier, marble everything throughout everything that we do. So that mission is something that all of our staff live and breathe intentionally. Like I mentioned, it's really a challenge to say we've got it right. I can't say we're done. We're constantly evaluating. So some of the things we'd like to do, we'd like to see, you mentioned legislation. Funding is huge, critical. We can provide all the technical assistance in the world, but if there's no capital behind any of those business ideas and those business plans, you're dead in the water, which is a shame. But I think knowing that we are a licensing agency and ultimately the regulator, we're not so sure that living within our agency is where the funding mechanism should come from. And also knowing that with this now label of being a social equity program participant and all the benefits that come along with that, how do you protect some of these folks from individuals or other entities that might want to latch on to that and go for that ride? And I would describe it as prey upon some of these businesses and some of these folks that are really trying to navigate a pretty technical process. And so building the right environment where they can share ideas and brainstorm together, but not, like I said, kind of make it a situation where folks can prey on them. That's a challenge, knowing that funding is so vital and it's so hard to come by because, as we know, traditional banking is not readily available to a lot of these folks. So funding, I'd say, would be the biggest barrier to entry across the entire industry today, and it's not unique to Massachusetts by any means. But that would allow us to really, I think, square nicely with our programming. If they could segue into a capital market that was available to them, it would be an ideal situation. But it's not something we have at our disposal. We support our programming through our agency's administrative budget, but there is no loan fund or any other grant fund even. Is knowing that the idea is to build generational wealth through any social equity programming. Access to capital is what stands between them and that opportunity to do so.
Excellent. You mentioned people who work in ancillary businesses. There might be, HVAC people or IT people or what have you. And I've been in some of those grow facilities, for instance, that pretty specialized operations. It probably does take some little extra training and education. Is that, are people able to get benefits under the program for technical assistance, to really jump into that part of the business?
They can, yeah. That's the eligibility is really that you reside in one of those areas of disproportionate impact, and there's 29 we've identified across Massachusetts. That's really based on both arrest data and unemployment data, and we're actually in the process now of reevaluating those areas. We've also been specific based on census tract as well, because, for instance, labeling Boston as being an area of disproportionate impact would include places like Beacon Hill and the Back Bay, which are pretty affluent, as well as places like Dorchester, Roxbury, which have really been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. And so we've limited within larger cities, Worcester, Springfield, Lowell, and Boston, the areas in the neighborhood specifically. If you reside in one of those areas, you have a marijuana offense in your background or within your immediate family's background, knowing that the war on drugs impacted families, not just individuals, but family units. And if you have that history and you are otherwise eligible, we also look at income, 400% of the federal poverty level. You could be eligible for this program. The technical assistance, though, you may not want a license, and that's okay. And I think that's where we look at what success of our program is. you can't just have a metric that is licensure or just agent registration. If we have that ancillary track, we know that there are a lot of electricians that are going to do well in this industry. There's a lot of IT folks, knowing that we require a pretty high IT capability and a lot of network capability for seed to sale tracking and point of sale transactions. Someone to go in and equip all of that inventory management, someone to manage your entire IT backbone, knowing that you might have multiple locations. If someone that runs a business like that may have a marijuana conviction in their background, we shouldn't be forcing them into the industry just to get that benefit. But instead, I think that's where we can make this a Commonwealth-wide endeavor where it grows beyond our agency and our regulatory scope. So yes, that absolutely is one of our tracks. I think it was a really great idea that didn't come from me. And I think that's where we tried to listen to a lot of folks to say, what is social equity and what would benefit a broader, more expansive cohort of people.
Thanks. Very well said, and I'm sure people are going to have. I want to engage in some conversation as the discussion goes on, but let's move on to Deshita Dawson, who's the cannabis program supervisor for the city of Portland, Oregon, the other coast, and is also founder of and chief executive officer of her own business called Weedhead. I'm
Sure.
tossing it over to you. I was going to lead off by saying Portland has one of the only freestanding municipal programs. I guess there are some others in California, which, as I understand, grew out of the state's legalization program. But how does the city interact with the state? And are you finding conflicting rules and regulations that are a problem for social equity programs, or is it all pretty complementary?
Hi, thank you so much, Mark. Yes, I'm Deshita Dawson, and I oversee the program for the city of Portland. And one of the nuances about being the local jurisdiction that's sort of leading the state is that we get to do so on maybe a smaller level, prove certain things work, and then bubble it up to the state level. In 2016, the city of Portland voted on a ballot initiative that cannabis tax revenue would be reinvested back into the community, most specifically the Black, Indigenous, and Latinx community, those most harmed. And a little bit different from Sean, because our program is housed in the Office of Community and Civic Life, we believe in equity-centered regulations. I think the idea of equity in general comes out of this idea that public policy, public resources, and roles, revenue, all should be equitably dispersed among the population, and all should be able to be equitably accessed. So for us to have started a whole new industry, and in many cases, like in Oregon, being a first mover and not having thought of the equity component, it really was a miss. And it's great to see that jurisdictions are trying to go back to fix it. I'm happy to be part of the pioneers that have already started to implement how cannabis tax revenue can actually be run out of the regulatory program to be reinvested. We now have that also, of course, in Illinois in a much larger way. And we are looking to introduce an equity bill for Oregon that has a substantial cannabis tax revenue component. Outside of that, we do have an equity designation that is about really that economic empowerment, similar to what Sean described. It's about size of your business and potential direct impact as a result of any arrests or convictions. And it is a fee reduction. And I think when you ask that question, Mark, about some of the challenges with the state not having an equity program, it really does create a rub when we want to create one at the city level. And I think we've been primed to be able to do so as aligned with our city council and our overall racial equity goals. But we can't do so without a state equity track because we wind up getting a lot of people licensed at the city level that are not having any expedited licensing at the state level kind of get stuck in a room. And in doing so, we actually put them at a more of a disadvantage. They wind up holding their inventory or real estate a lot longer before they're able to actually be fully licensed. And to be licensed in our jurisdiction in Portland, it requires state licensing. So we have seen that rub. We haven't been able to advance our program in the last 4 years because there is no state program. But we're happy to be partners with OLCC and working with them at a state level on a cannabis equity work group. And we've been part of the architects on that policy. We also are happy to partner with other jurisdictions to share equity-centered regulations and also acknowledge that the markets that are doing well don't really have as much regulatory enforcement based rules. The markets that are really thriving are a lot easier to facilitate. And so our regulatory management is all about facilitative management. I use the analogy of like getting a driver's license is a regulatory process. We just don't expect for it to be such a painful and arduous one, but it is one that is, by definition, that's what it is. And so I think we do a great job, and I really have to shout out my team because I inherited an amazing team. Christina Corset is our licensing and policy coordinator, and they oversee facilitative licensing for the businesses. And I think that's very different from the way markets had originally gotten started, where it was like, we need to enforce the people that are interested in cannabis because there's still something shady there. And I think we're starting to overcome that in our policy and regulation within the state of Oregon. I would just also add that we are starting to challenge the definition as well at a national level. I think we're looking for equity in total. And I think because of the fact that racially biased cannabis prohibition, right, enforcement has impacted very specific, and we have numbers for it thanks to ACLU and other groups, but we have very specific data that points us to the fact that we need to do this work in a more deliberate way to reverse it. And the data points to the racially biased enforcement causing harm to every health determinant. And so we can't just focus on getting people in the business of cannabis when we know that the prohibition of cannabis has forced a lot of detriment among communities on every health determinant, whether it's mortality rate or unemployment rate, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to try to figure out ways to give that back. And I think Illinois is a newer example that we point to that broadly has describe that. And the Social Equity and Educational Development, or SEED initiatives program within the city of Portland, which I helped launch this year, is our direction on that too. It's a community reinvestment grant fund out of cannabis tax revenue. And there isn't a requirement that you have to be going into the cannabis industry to leverage it. It really is about how do you provide education, entrepreneurial and economic development opportunity and expungement or criminal justice support within the communities that have been most harmed.
Yeah, I know we don't want to think sort of exclusively about cannabis-related programs. This is a big socioeconomic issue, a whole set of issues. But do you find it kind of exciting that, here you have a chance to start a new industry, regulate a new industry, provide opportunities in a new way that probably you can't go back and unwind a lot of things in the rest of our economy and the rest of our society. But here you have an opportunity to maybe organize some, these cannabis-related programs with cannabis-related funding, perhaps. Is that kind of an exciting part of the whole job?
It's definitely very exciting for me, and I appreciate getting the support through the director of the bureau and the city council to be able to create a vision statement for our program. Yes, we are a regulatory and compliance office, but we've designed our framework so that we can actually deliver on the reparative and restorative opportunities that cannabis legalization can do. I don't think one is mutually exclusive, like they're not exclusive. We put together our best efforts to try to create a framework where we're allowed to do both. And yes, there's still a wall, if you will, in how we are doing both. And I'm constantly explaining it. I spent a a good first 3 months creating the framework visually just so we could take people through it. But that has been probably the most exciting thing. But also, as a former business executive, I believe in benchmarks and comping or comparison analysis, and being able to leverage all of the work that's happening with Sean, Joey, Portia in Illinois. Like, the reality is that that's what really excites me. How do we take the body of work and do analysis so that we don't go back, we don't have regressive policies put in place, but everything is forward moving and progressive, building upon what people have already done. And so, with that being said, I'll say the last thing that is really exciting for me is this last week we were able to announce the Cannabis Regulators of Color Coalition, which is truly a coalition of regulators that have been appointed or selected for government official roles, bringing together equity-centered thoughts and experiences in one spot, in order for us to provide guidance, much needed guidance at the federal, state, and local level. We don't want any more new government policies created without the learnings all aggregated in a proper way for people to roll out, really.
I think that's fantastic because I spent some time this spring and summer, looking at each of the states and their regulatory approach to social equity programs, and it seemed like there was an awful lot of cutting and pasting. All right, Joey, let's hear it from Colorado. You're one of the early adopters here as well of cannabis legalization, but the legislature just passed a law this spring, right? Maybe it's in March, as I recall, to jumpstart social equity type programs. And yours looks a little different. As I had to read the rules a few times to figure out exactly what the the incubator program was all about, but a very interesting approach. And I see other states, considering the same. Can you want to launch into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's funny that the accelerator program is something that has existed, and that the state was planning to do some additional rulemaking around this year, when the legislature passed House Bill 1424. And House Bill 1424 is what kind of it created that framework for what will be the state's criteria for who would qualify as a cannabis or as an equity applicant for a cannabis business license. And then in the process, it also went back and made some adjustments to what the accelerator program would be. When you actually look at our equity criteria for who those applicants are, there's a lot of parity in what we see around the country. And I think that's to Sean and Dashita's points that there are folks who have started to do this work, and we can look at them and see what some of those best practices are, and what maybe we need to do a little bit differently for folks here in Colorado. But the criteria is, it's going to look a lot like what we see in other markets. The applicant or applicants for that license, they must own 51% of their license. They have to be Colorado residents. They can't have been the owner of a license that was previously subject to state administrative action that resulted in the revocation of their state license.
Mhm.
And then what we see in the kind of you can meet one of the other three criteria. It's related to marijuana offenses or convictions, marijuana arrests or convictions, or that you were subject to civil asset forfeiture as a result of a marijuana investigation. And that's for the applicant or their parent or their legal guardian, their sibling, their spouse, a child, a minor in their care. So really someone who was directly impacted by marijuana prohibition. And then another criteria would be that the applicant resided for 15 years from 1980 to 2010 in census tracts that are either designated opportunity zones or they're census tracts that are in the top 15th percentile for residents who are receiving public assistance, falling below the federal poverty level, not graduating from high school, or unemployment. And then the final kind of criteria that you could meet to qualify as an equity applicant is that the applicant's household income in that year prior to application didn't exceed 50% of the state median income, and that's measured by the number of people that are in their household. I think we see, I mean, a lot of those same criteria in other markets. Many markets have identified ways to benefit people, certainly who were impacted by cannabis arrests or convictions, and then others who have maybe faced inequities in employment or education opportunities, excuse me. I think in other markets, things that we've seen that we really like, license exclusivity for equity applicants is certainly something we've seen in other markets and something that we're very likely to propose to Denver City Council as a part of our comprehensive equity program. We've also seen financial and technical assistance. Sean and Dashita had mentioned some of these things, but priority application review, low interest loans, grants, fee waivers, accelerator programs like what you had mentioned at the state level, compliance consultations and workshops. I think those are really likely to become components of the program we build here in Denver too. And then it's also just really critical to note that House Bill 2014-24 is the bill that created the framework for our state's equity criteria. That gave the governor the ability to grant pardons to individuals convicted of the possession of up to 2 ounces of marijuana without application and without input from district attorneys and judges. That's critical, I think, and something we have seen in other markets. Ultimately, I think that's going to allow more people to benefit from ownership and employment opportunities in the cannabis industry.
Yeah, really, or any industry. Depending on where they want to look for work or
Housing.
Yeah. I assume that the Denver program will be, when you combine that with the state resources that are being contributed toward, social equity type programs, that just multiplies the effect. I guess that's what you're hoping.
I think that at least initially, we're hoping to align as much as possible with the state, so that something that we have maybe seen in other places is when there are really disparate programs at the state and the local level, becomes much harder for folks to navigate and to understand. They may qualify or meet the suitability findings at the state for ownership of a marijuana or a cannabis license, but not at the city. And having that different criteria, I think, has some unintended consequences. So to the extent that we can, I think we want to align as much as we can our program and our criteria with the states. And then we want to think about areas where we may be able to have really more direct impact, things that we can control. So some of our application requirements, some of the things that may have presented barriers to entry in the past for any of our applicants. Certainly now knowing that access to capital is a challenge that we've heard our equity applicants will have as they're entering the cannabis space. And so we want to be mindful about how our application processes are going to impact them. And if it's going to take them much longer to achieve licensure, how do we streamline that so that they're not investing all of the capital that they've raised just to get them through to the period that they're achieving licensure before they can start to generate revenue. But I think, when we're talking about financial assistance and things like that, that's where things are starting to get trickier. And I think that's one of the challenges that we face being a mature market, is that the carve outs or establishing those funds from the beginning, that wasn't done. And so now we're having to go back and find ways to create funding mechanisms and to think creatively about how we're going to do that.
I've seen the pie chart of where Colorado, how Colorado apportions all the cannabis tax revenue, and looks like it's pretty well spoken for. Be in a big wrestling match, the health agencies and others.
And that is a challenge in mature markets, is that it's kind of been earmarked for, for other things. And in Denver, a portion of our special tax on adult use cannabis goes to funding affordable housing. So there are areas where the money's reinvested in communities. And so now we have to think about ways to create new funding streams, or to reallocate funding to support a program so that it is as meaningful as it can be.
Yeah, you're right that some of those, uh, some of the ways that the money is dedicated is for community, enhancement. So that's gets to one of the things that we were concluding at NACB, that you can't stop at the shoreline here. You have to think a little bit bigger and broader when you're thinking about what to do, to help bring some of these communities back from back from the oppression that they've suffered from through the war on drugs. Um, okay, let me move over to Portia Mittens, who is the owner of the Coffee Pot, and is chair of the Social Equity and Racial Justice Committee for Oregon retailers of cannabis. And so I'm curious. Portia, I did hear you talking the other day about the task of defining social equity has kind of caused some issues within the Illinois cannabis program. And I just wondered if you could elaborate on that. I know you're not the only one that Dashida's raised similar issues, but I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that.
Sure. And the Sheeta, I would just like to say, when you all start doling out that money for social equity in Oregon, like, can we backtrack it to like 2017 when I opened? I'm just joking. But they're doing a great job in Oregon. Dashita and her team. I'm a late. I was added on late to the Oregon staff, but they've done a great job, and I'm just elated to be able to assist moving forward. But as you stated, yes, I am also in Illinois, and we just did our first round of applications for social equity, and they were supposed to be awarded May 1st, but um, the results came out, and they were so ag- I don't know, I don't even know the word to use for it. We were just shocked. They were giving out 75 licenses, and they only chose 21 organizations to give those 75 licenses to. And of those 21, I would say two or three were true social equity. Sean spoke to the idea of people not being taken advantage of, and that's one of the challenges that you meet when you're talking about social equity, is trying to get people in a place where they are educated enough, they have the funding, and so they're not in a desperate place to a quote unquote sell their social equity. I mean, I even received calls from people saying, "Hey, you know anyone who wants to sell their social equity?" I'm like, "What?" Like, no. First of all, if I did, I wouldn't tell you. But secondly, no. And third, no again. Um, but I will say this to Illinois' benefit, is that even though it did not turn out initially the way that we all imagined it would, they the government here, led by Toy Hutchinson, tell her thank you very much. They're willing to go back to the drawing board and reevaluate and say, okay, this was the intent. This is what happened. How can we align those two? And that's where we currently are in that space. It has caused a little bit of backlash, and there have been financial issues because of that, that people have had to come up against that they didn't plan. But It's better to get it done early than to get into it and then have to go and try to fix it after the fact.
Yeah, and Illinois' program, just like its legalization laws, is fairly recent
Yes.
development, and a lot of people who seem to think it's, it's one of the has potential for being one of the state of the art programs in the end.
We went legal January 1st of this year, so recreationally.
Yeah,
So that's how new it is.
yeah. One of the interesting aspects of it, which I sort of referred to a few minutes ago, is the R3
hmm
program, the Restore, Reinvest, and Renew program, where like 25% of the state's
hmm
cannabis revenue take is to be uh, dedicated to uh, basically non-cannabis redevelopment. And if you have familiarity with that, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yes. So what the state did was very similar to what they did, Joey, in your state, is where they looked at the different areas and said, okay, by the census tract, this area was affected the most, this area is affected in this point. And so they doled out the money accordingly, percentage wise. And then then you can apply within your area if you live there, reside there for part of that grant. For example, I am in Kankakee County. Kankakee County was allotted 8 million for this area. So I didn't have to be a nonprofit. I did not have to be a 501c3. I did not have to be a church. I could be any of those things. But you could be a business, a nonprofit, an individual, and you could apply with and give them your ideas of what you would like to do within your community for that money and say, this is my idea. This is how I would like to execute it. And then you could apply and they could say yes or say no. And it's going through that process now where they're reviewing it. And the reason I like that a lot is because when we're talking about social equity and we're talking about equity in general, it wasn't just cannabis that was affected. When you put someone in jail for cannabis or for anything for that matter, it matters how much money comes into that home now. It matters you had two parents, now you have one. So now parent that's still there has to get second job, which then leaves the child alone a little longer, which then allows them to have more freedom to do things that they probably shouldn't be doing. And then, the money is taken away from that area. So the schools suffer because of that. Jobs suffer because of that. Taxes suffer because of that. And so I think Illinois did a really good job of saying, okay, these were the areas that were affected all the way around. So we're going to give them an opportunity to be fixed all the way around. If you can't just say we're going to invest in cannabis because cannabis affected so many other things. And Illinois recognized that. And they're giving the people who live there, who know the problems, who know the issues, who have the relationships to go in and fix them. You will be much more. I'll use me for example. I would be much more better received at Kankakee High School to go in and implement a program because I went there, I graduated there. My sister taught there, so they know Miss Mittens. So if I go in with something, the children are more receptive to it versus, no offense to the government, but the government coming in and saying we're going to implement this program and we're bringing in people from Springfield.
Yeah.
Kids are like, I know
We're here
you,
to
but
help you.
me, I could be like, Trayvon, I'm calling your mom, and so I think Illinois did really well in the R3 program in that they allowed anyone who had a passion and a heart and a viable idea and could talk about that to be able to at least apply and get their idea out there
Yeah.
so that the ones who know the issues, the ones who can personally address them, can then go in and help and try to fix them in a well-rounded manner.
I think a lot of states would find it, or advocates in the states would find it very difficult to get the state to contribute, 25% of its cannabis revenue on top of
Hmm.
maybe another 5 or 10% that it costs to run the program.
Right.
Um, it's that a lot of people have ideas, uh, other ideas for how to spend it.
I just have to quickly say that that's where the challenge comes from because, for example, in New Jersey, by just eliminating cannabis prohibition as a function, they're saving $145 million a year. I mean, again, I'm a businesswoman, so just looking at the numbers alone, 145 million saved means at minimum, if we make that back in the revenue, we could probably just shift that into the communities. I think we have to be very, very clear on what the ask is when we talk about cannabis equity and how the revenue works. We have built multiple industries, most primarily the prison industrial complex industry, and we have spent a lot of money within states to criminalize this. The savings that happens there, I don't see why there isn't an automatic conversation around how does that at very least, get redistributed back to the communities that it was used against. I find a struggle, yes, that we are running up a hill on the discussion, but I think in the wake of what has happened this year, understanding the momentum behind racial equity, understanding the thread that Portia just said, is not just Illinois, it's every state, and there are some states that are huge that have done this. New York being one of them, where I'm from. The disproportion in which specific communities were targeted, it's very clear to show that incarceration, mass incarceration, large percentage of it was tied to cannabis prohibition. And cannabis prohibition represented almost 50% of all drug arrests. And when you have these disproportions, you can use the numbers, follow the numbers to show that that's where most of the targeting went. I don't see why our government isn't expected to figure out, and not all in one sweep, but figure out what's the proper way to backtrack that in order to make sure that those same communities get to be reinvested in. And a good way to do this, and we did it in Portland this year in June when the city council voted to divest the cannabis tax revenue that was going to the police bureau. Again, we have to use the backdrop of what's happening socially in our favor, and we have that momentum. And I think there are some things that do not make sense. Cannabis tax revenue is a whole new revenue for states. Why is it that it's already being pre-allocated and it does not first deal with equity? And when we're shocked that nobody wants to shock the legal market, is partially because we're not doing the right thing about ensuring that the communities most harmed have actually going to benefit from the legal market. It's circular, and it's also revenue impacting, and a lot of states need to recognize that as well. Um, that again is my experience on both the private sector leading and doing strategy for municipalities across the country, but also now within the public sector. I feel like it's a responsibility, and that's what equity actually means at the policy level.
Excuse me, this is Megan. There was some questions in the chat that I wanted to be able to fit in here before the end of our time. So the first one is, it's really helpful to know what the criteria are and how they compare nationwide. Can you talk more about best practices in terms of what's actually working so far?
Okay, so Megan, do you take that to mean is it criteria for being for qualifying to be a social equity licensee?
Yes. That's what I believe Sam meant.
Yeah. So do you all find that the criteria are significantly different from one state to another state in terms of who the program is designed to benefit?
As we've kind of been tracking this in Denver, we created an internal spreadsheet where we look at different different features of different programs around the country. So we look at how countries offer priority application processing or financial assistance or technical assistance, if they have accelerator programs, if there's license exclusivity. And so one of the things that we looked at across the country is the criteria for who is an equity applicant. And I think that 51% threshold for ownership is fairly standard across the industry. I think cannabis arrests and convictions, fairly standard across a lot of the equity programs that we see. We see income as kind of that's a feature of a lot of the criteria across the country, as well as defining disproportionate impacted areas. Now, how those disproportionate impacted areas are defined, I think, is where it gets a little bit different, and you see more divergent approaches around the country. But to kind of the second part of that question, which is what's working best so far, I think it's really still a little too soon to tell. And in Colorado, I couldn't tell you because we have an effective date of January 1st, 2021 for the state criteria for someone to qualify at the state level as an equity applicant. And then in Denver, depending on when we're able to get in front of council, the effective date may be a little later than that. So we won't know how this works in practice. What I've seen, in my research on what's happening around the industry is some cities like San Francisco or Long Beach are seeing lower participation rates, and you may say that translates to lower success or that the criteria isn't right. I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I think it's a 1% of the equity applicants are actually have achieved licensure in Long Beach, and maybe it's 2% or 3% in San Francisco. And I think one of the primary challenges there is the access to capital. And so I don't think yet that we know this criteria really worked in getting these applicants into the industry. I think there are some other things like access to capital that present additional barriers. But what we see is, I think, a lot of parity in terms of some of those key figures, like the 51% ownership, definitely talking about cannabis arrests or convictions, definitely identifying some kind of disproportionate impacted area. And then around the income piece, I think it really does vary, and it depends state by state and city by city. Because, if we were to look at, I'm seeing 80% when I open this spreadsheet and I look, some places have, income requirements that your annual family income was at or below 80% of the area median income. So I think that number is really going to depend on where you're at, and maybe rightfully so that it can have the greatest impact.
Good. There have been some questions about best practices, things that, really seem to make a difference.
I would like to
There's some,
piggyback on Joey, because something that makes a difference, at least in Illinois, was the actual application itself and the requirements of the application. It's one thing to say, okay, you qualify for
Mhm.
the discounted rate, but then you have an application that requires you to spend an additional, so you get half off for being social equity, 2,500. But then your application requires you to have a floor plan, a security plan, a building, um, you know, maybe hire someone to help write your application because it is so laborious. So yeah, you get 2,500 off, but then you have to find another 40K to even apply, in addition to the month-long process it's going to take you to fill out the paperwork, because you have exhibits A through O, and you have a business plan, that's 15 to 20 pages. So, saying, yeah, you qualify to apply. Well, when I do apply, I still have to come up with another X amount of dollars and then another amount of expertise. And you're asking for expertise that I couldn't, and I'm saying generally speaking, I couldn't possibly know because I'm brand new, because I wasn't supposed to be selling weed beforehand. Wink, wink. So you know. So if I truly am new to this, this truly is a new enterprise, how am I supposed to know some of these things to even apply, to even qualify?
Just to quickly piggyback, I'm sorry, Sean, go ahead.
No,
Because we
please, after you.
I was just going to say she's right. And so, Oakland has done a great job modeling. They have a city appointed vendors, a number of vendors that support people going through the actual process of the application. And within Oregon, for our new state equity designation, some of the best practices I found, and we reference Massachusetts on this, is having the or, right? So there's a lot of different ways that you can qualify because we've had trouble, in my opinion, with the constitutionality about doing what we feel like I think is the right thing, which is all of the things that Joey just said. Yes, we're handling equity in that, but we've got to call out just the populations that we know have been most impacted. And in Oregon and the states across the country, that's Black, Indigenous, and Latinx populations. And to not call that out, it often sometimes means we're also not communicating to those communities that, hey, this is something for you to participate in. All the other language is a little bit more unclear. So to have that or designation, meaning you can do this or you can be this, that was something that came out of Massachusetts that I think is a really good best practice. And it might be needed to be tweaked based on your jurisdiction, but it's still an important component.
Deshita, one of the things that I've noticed, I think was what we found out when we were doing our study, is that because of the Ohio Supreme Court decision, um, which basically is totally discourages state laws from identifying groups by racial identity. They've moved to more other economic criteria. They define the eligible applicants by other economic criteria. I don't know a way around that. If using racial identification is somehow unconstitutional, then we got a real problem.
Well, I think that's where the or comes in. But Sean, I don't know if you want to jump in more about you guys.
Yeah, there's a few points I'd like to make, and I'll try to organize my thoughts in a somewhat organized way. On the eligibility piece, I mentioned earlier we have this economic empowerment criteria for priority review, and there's fee waivers associated with it. That had this laundry list of about 6 different criteria that you could meet, and you had to meet at least 3 of them in some combination. And it did include racial specific elements, but it also included residing in certain areas. It included your ownership makeup of at least 51%, of course, but it also looked at things like your intentions to hire people and reaching certain thresholds. But that was more of a promise versus, because at this point you're still applying for a license. As well, our social equity program, knowing that it's not quite the same threshold or gravity as being licensed, it's more access to technical assistance. We did look at the family unit of if there's a conviction with your spouse or your parent or someone in your immediate family, or if you have a conviction in your background. And then we had that income criteria. But knowing through that, you're getting access to programming, not so much a license. But I think, Portia, you touched on something about once you get through that threshold of getting into the program or having access to that queue, the application itself is still daunting. And we've tried to explore that ourselves quite a bit. And one of the things that we've actually recently done was, I may have a marijuana conviction in my background, and our statute actually says we have to ignore it for purposes of suitability, but I might have something else in my background that I just don't know. So we've focused on trying to do more outreach. So I think one of the things about our programming is, if you're not talking to people where they are, and unfortunately you mentioned this too, about that credibility of walking in and saying, hi, we're the government, and this time I swear we're good for it. That's a challenge, and I think we need to acknowledge that and understand it. And I think let that sink into us. So outreach is huge. If you just build this great program and nobody knows about it, you're doomed. But that suitability background is one where some of our newest license types in Massachusetts, I think, are really promising. It's delivery, and what we've said is exclusively for 3 years. Those are available to economic empowerment applicants and social equity program participants. So the market is yours for 3 years. We will then evaluate the data to see if we've actually met our statutory charge of having that meaningful impact. What we've also allowed is for this concept of pre-certification. It's no cost at all. And what you need to supply is really attestations that say, when you do my background check, and we do a really thorough background check, including safe as fingerprints, that's expensive too. There's a fee associated with that. So all these attestations will make essentially a preliminary determination on your application, which you can then use to shop. You can bring it to investors and say, look, the Cannabis Control Commission of Massachusetts has said, I'm at least likely to get a license. They're not guaranteeing anything, but there's a good chance, and they've looked at my information. We haven't done a full background check, so I've described it, for an analogy's sake, as pre-approval for a mortgage. You've evaluated my application and said, I'm unlikely to get a mortgage. I can now go look for the house that I want to buy. Here I've been pre-approved essentially for a license. I need to go figure out what city or town I want to be in. I need to go get my capital behind me and start building up my business a little more. But what we've demonstrated, hopefully, is momentum. And so I, as a social equity program participant, or I as an economic empowerment applicant, I've now realized some progress here. And I think that we're really new in this process. We've done about 25 or so pre-certifications. We've now approved, I think it's 3 total delivery applications for a provisional license. But folks at least are realizing momentum. I think it's a really important piece that we didn't institute it right away. We got feedback that said, I'm having a hard time. I understand you're promising me all these things. I just can't access them because I don't know if when I actually fill out that application, I'm still going to get denied because I have another conviction in my background, or something else might come up, and you're telling me you can't tell me now because you haven't run the background check. I'll self-disclose whatever you need to know. Just give me an answer. And so here, that's the process we've built, but we've tried to ease that application. And the only thing you have to fill out when you come back is the rest of the application. Don't repeat filling out the same nonsense that you already gave us. So I think we're trying to make it easy. But Mark, I see you might be getting impatient with us, so I'll turn it back to you.
No, I'm going. I think the discussion's been terrific, and I wish we could go on because there were a couple other questions that we're getting at some of the nuances of what you guys are talking about. But I'm going to follow up with each of you and anybody else, of course, who wants to know more about the NACB proposal that we made on social equity, and just so you can see what the details are. These are the things that we concluded were best practices. So that may answer some of the questions that some of the participants have. But if you have thoughts that you'd like to feed back to us, we'd love to have that too. Thank you so much. This has been terrific.
Thank you for having me. Been a pleasure.